Hey everyone. Okay, so hopefully you watched the previous video about the color theory, histories, and vocabulary. Now we're going to get into the mixing part. You'll be able to find this workbook on the website and at our Canvas class, so you can kind of follow along. If we had been in the face-to-face studio, I would have printed some of these workbook pages on cardstock for you. So you can either, if you have cardstock, you can print them on that. If you don't, normal paper should work fine. It'll just buckle a little. Or if you just want to freehand it on a sheet of mixed media board, then it'll hold up a little better. But it's up to you how you unfold it. Okay, so before we actually start painting, I want to talk a little bit about paint. So here's the histories that we discussed. Here's a quiz for the vocabulary, not to be graded, but just kind of to see if you can check yourself on some of this vocabulary. And I'm going to try to use the vocabulary during our mixing session, but if you get lost, then you can reference these documents. Next in the workbook, we have a color wheel, which I will unfold. We're going to start just by talking about the inside of the color wheel, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then we're going to talk about how to mix neutrals and chromatic grays. And then we're going to mix tints, tones, and shades, also neutralizing with a little bit of complement. So hopefully by the end of this, you have a really good understanding of how you can control your paint mixing. This last page in the workbook is just a little bit of ideas or thoughts about how you can layer and mix color, and it's like a little mark making lab, so you can review that and do that if you want. Not necessary, but just some things to think about when you're practicing different techniques. Okay, so before we talk about the color wheel, I just want to talk a little bit about paint. So this is, if you ordered the kit online, this is the acrylic set that we got. Usually when something says studio acrylic, it means it's student grade. So we have a fairly low cost set of paint, but I wanted to talk about some of the different qualities before we get going. This is what it looks like inside. We have a titanium white, a Mars black, cadmium red, cadmium yellow. Oh, I should read them properly. Cadmium red, medium hue. So what the hue in this case means, unlike in a regular vocabulary where hue just means the name of a color, in this instance, it means that the pigment is fake, making it much less expensive. So if this had said cadmium red medium, it would have been a real pigment that came from the ground, not from a lab. And so that affects the tinting strength of the paint. This is a cad yellow medium hue, phthalo green, and blue. So what you see here is you have your achromatics, and then you have your primaries. I ran out of my Blick blue, and I'll show you how different this paint is in a minute when we start painting. So you have your primaries, but then you also have a phthalo green. If a paint sounds like fake sugar, phthalo, phthalocene, diazoline, alizarin, they don't sound natural. They sound like they came from a lab, kind of like sucrose or saccharin. Those paints typically are jewel tone and transparent. The reason that these starter kits, this is a color theory kit, often come with an extra green is because when we mix these together to make green, they're going to be a more naturalistic kind of I'm going to use the word muddy, but I don't think that's right. Desaturated is the technical word of the green that it'll create. And this is a higher chroma, brighter, vibrant, jeweled tone one. So I can show you how that'll unfold later. Before we start mixing though, I'm just going to grab the red and put this aside for a second. So this is the one in our kit. And I just want to show you some of the different kinds of paints. The paints that I have here that we can buy in America, this is probably the most expensive one that we see, this Liquitex brand. I can't find my Golden paint, but Golden is a brand that is this competitor. So this and Golden would be the brands that would be the highest quality. This is an inexpensive Hobby Lobby paint that has a slight gloss to it. These are, you can tell a little different because they're in the plastic tubes as opposed to these metal tubes, are the super, super student grade. And then when you get into these little bit nicer tubes, they're just a step higher. Utrecht is a student, kind of a student lower quality paint, but this though is a higher one because it says artist color instead of student. However, it says series 1, so it's a little cheaper. The higher the number in the series, that means that the more expensive the pigment is in it and the more expensive the paint gets. So when you start buying paints like these or this is, it looks like plastic, but it's actually not. It's like a metal kind of body. You're gonna pay, so like this is a naphtha crimson. This compared to a cadmium red, the exact same paint would be different prices because you're paying for the actual pigment. Okay, so I just want to show you a little bit of the paint, and I mostly want to look at the temperature of them. So here's our blick that we have in our kit. I'm going to put a little bit of red out, cadmium red, medium hue. And then this is actually, let's use this one. This is a red as well, but a different name, Permanent Rose. Oh, that's more like a pink. That's not the one I wanted. But still falling in the red camp. Here we have a Grumbacher brand, which is an alizarin crimson, which on the label looks kind of purple, but when you squirt it out, it's very red, but it's a different temperature. So when people start learning about paint and mixing, this is where a lot of problems come in, because you have a warm red that tends towards orange, and you have a cool red that tends towards violet. So this is where people get into a little bit of a trouble. So what I'm going to show you with this super cheap ultra blue that I have is I'm going to squirt a little of this out on the other side of my palette. We'll build a palette together, but I always try to keep my warms and my cools opposite. Okay, I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to try to mix 2 purples. So we have a primary and a primary. We're going to make a secondary. I'm going to take this off of here so this doesn't confuse us. It's a pretty color though. Okay, so I'm going to start with this orangey red, the cadmium. And the rule I want you guys to always follow is that you start with the light color and then you add the dark color. And the reason for this is if I had started with this much blue and tried to put this much red into it, it wouldn't move it very far. So the paint would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I have way more than I need. Whereas if I start with the light and then I use that much cool, I might use a little more, you'll see it shift. Notice, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but this paint from our kit has a strong peak to it. So it's got a little bit thicker viscosity. This is the Grumbacher, and it's a little less stiff. And this cheaper paint, the acrylic advantage, art advantage, is real runny. It's more kind of soupy, and it has this weird grainy quality to it, which is kind of gross, but we'll make it work. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of the blue. I'm going to try to make a violet. And remember, if this is leaning warmer towards the orange side, what's the complement of blue? Orange. And when you mix complements together, they cancel each other and make a kind of muddier color. So this is often where people throw up their hands and say, I don't want to paint. So as we practiced with the black and white in the earlier lesson, squish that paint back and forth. And then you can see that you have a kind of pretty maroon color, but not quite purple. So I'm going to try and add a little more blue. Maybe I'll add some more and see if I can really shift it to a violet. It still has that real maroony, and it kind of feels a little more brown, again, because this is sitting more on the orange side. There it goes. That's pretty. Also, when you're painting, you want to look more at that color when it's spread out, like here, because that looks pretty dark and you can't really tell what's happening. But when you pull it out, you can get a better sense of where it's at. So this is the red in our kit. And yours might look a little different because I ran out of my blue. So your blue will be a little different than mine, but close. Okay, I'm going to rinse off my knife, clean it off. And while that might look a little muddy, it's actually a really beautiful color and looks more like the world that we live in. I challenge you to look around the world today and see how low chroma most things are. There's some pops of high chroma, the bright, bright green grass in the spring, the bright, bright leaves in the spring. But as the summer goes on, those get darker and darker and they desaturate. In the base of the world, behind the trees, around the trees, underneath the grass, there's so much low chroma that then supports those pretty pops of color. So we actually want these if we want to try to create something like the world. Okay, now I'm going to mix with a different kind of red. So you can see it's already cooler. And see what kind of violet I get. Ooh, that's lovely. So this would be more something that felt like something you'd see on jewelry or on fabrics, but not as much of this color would be in the real world, natural kind of space. So again, if I pull it out, you can see the difference. I still think that's really pretty, but just not quite the same. So I'm just preparing you that because we have this color theory mixing set and a limited palette, we're gonna sit more in this space, and that's okay. We're just trying to learn how to mix color. And while you may go on past this class and not necessarily be a painter, and you might use the computer or printmaking ink or different things, you still have the knowledge of how this functions as it translates to other sections. Okay, I'm gonna put this aside. If you decided to do this little exercise with me, what you can do with the extra paint is you can save it in your little cups. I don't have the cups that are in the kit. These were in the Dick Blick kit. You have 8 of them for paint storage. What I'm gonna use is, well, this is what I use in my studio. And in our 2D design class, we don't buy these because they're fairly expensive. It's a Masterson Stay Wet palette. Let me show you what's inside of it. The lid peels off like a Tupperware. The really good seal. Ooh, that's a very old palette that I've used for a long time. You can see that I've separated my cools and my warms, my darks and my lights, which I'll explain when we start building a palette. But I've had this acrylic paint wet for probably 40 days, month and a half, something like that. And it is still quite wet. And I'll explain this as it goes. But of course you don't have these. We were going to use these instead, just because they're really inexpensive way to kind of get into making a palette and effective. If you don't have those, it's going to be pretty important that you find a way to save your paint so that you don't have to keep mixing and mixing. So I was thinking a way that we could do this at home without spending a ton of money that said, if you are excited about painting, I really highly recommend that Masterson Stay Wet palette. I'll put a link to it on Dick Blick. But you can take a cookie sheet and some plastic wrap. And I might put like some kind of dishware, some kind of something to raise up my plastic wrap a little bit so it doesn't touch. And you can wrap your palette and then come back to it later. But you have to seal it really well to have it stay tight. And then you would imagine that I would, well, I'll wrap the whole thing so that it hopefully stays dry, stays wet a little longer. The other thing I would do is if you have a little spray bottle from an old cleaning supply packaging or something that you have, I use these. I would have had these in the face-to-face classroom for us. But before you cover it, you can just mist it a couple times and that keeps it wet. That's how I keep the Masterson Stay Wet from these drying up. I squirt the palette before I close it. So again, I'll put a link to this if you're interested in painting into the future, and it's a pretty good investment. And they're not very expensive. Okay, so I can save this later, or if you have these, you can scoop up your paint and put some in here. But we're gonna need these for our color wheel here in a minute too. Okay, so I think I'm gonna pause the video. I'm gonna put away all my red paints, and then we're gonna start in our next video by talking about the primaries making the secondaries. And we're not in the market just to paint a color wheel. We're really trying to build up our paint, make our palette so that we can finish out the whole project and not have to mix anymore. So I'm gonna pause the video, start a new one, and then we'll start to talk about the color wheel. Okay, see you guys soon. Thanks.